Diversity and inclusion in preservation.
Who tells your story?
Who tells our story?
Who tells our story?
The fact that cultural materials survive the passage of time is the result of a long chain of choices about care or neglect, sometimes purposeful, but many times happenstance.
Who gets to make the decisions of what, how, and when your history is preserved?
The answer determines the narrative that will be told to future generations.
The field of preservation is looking at itself and asking, how inclusive are we in our own profession? In the U.S., is our Western lens keeping us from seeing clearly the diversity of our materials and from being flexible in our own treatment approaches? As stewards of our cultural heritage, are we focusing only on a part of a larger collective memory? And who gets to be part of the club dedicated to saving the patrimony? What are we doing to welcome a more diverse workforce into our field?
Who tells our story?
People like us.
People like us.
People like us.
How can we honor the historical and indigenous conservation efforts that have preserved artifacts thus far? Can we empower communities to preserve their own heritage so that majority voices do not make assumptions about what is important? Miriam and I will explore the various efforts underway in the preservation and conservation fields to expand the diversity of staffing, education, and training in the stewardship of cultural heritage. We will also discuss how we create inclusive outreach and participation in this stewardship and develop culturally sensitive and equitable treatments for cultural heritage materials. We look forward to seeing you at the Elect Symposium. Please join us.
This presentation is based on a talk given by Anne-Marie Willer and myself for the Alex President Symposium on Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, held during the ALA's Midwinter Meeting in Atlanta, Georgia on January 20th, 2017. As you saw from the trailer we just played, when Anne-Marie and I first met to discuss the various aspects of diversity and inclusion in preservation, we found that we had more questions than answers. We had to leave many things out, mainly because of time, but more probably because of our lack of awareness about them. Most of the initiatives that we highlighted in this talk are in their preliminary stages, and we have only heard of them through word of mouth. By readdressing these issues during Preservation Week, we hope to broaden the conversation, and we look forward to our colleagues' input and that a continual dialogue will ensue. The first part of our talk is about examining and deconstructing our Western ideas of conservation and preservation. To explore this concept, I would like to begin with a project called Paper Road Tibet. My first exposure to an ethnographic approach to conservation occurred in 2001 when I was an MFA student in the Columbia College Center for Book and Paper Arts program. We studied bookbinding, letterpress, and papermaking. Jim Canary, conservator of the Lily Rare Books Library in Indiana University, gave a presentation on the Paper Road Tibet project. This is a group of Western scholars, papermakers, and conservators who traveled to Tibet with the aim to research the history of papermaking and to revitalize the tradition of hand papermaking in Tibet. They also work with the International Tibetan Archive Preservation Project in Lhasa, carrying out conservation work and training. During the course of their visits, they learned the true significance of paper in the Tibetan culture. Much of the textual culture, the religious texts, the scholarly works, business transactions, documents, and the currency were created on different papers, each with their own set of papermaking specifications of techniques and raw materials. The disruption of the specialized papermaking industry by the Chinese government meant the disruption of the cultural, religious, and economic life as it was known in Tibet during the time of the Dalai Lamas. Exchanging one type of paper for another, as for example using paper used for everyday school notes in a religious ritual and vice versa, would not be appropriate. Soon, the project team found that the preservation needs greatly exceeded their capabilities. Visa issues and a lack of time and funding impeded their efforts. In the case of conservation supplies, they needed to find the appropriate mending paper to conduct repairs. Jim Canary and his colleagues had been connecting with the surviving papermaking masters who relocated to Nepal to learn about the traditional crafts. The idea came forth that the elder paper makers could help teach the young people to pass on their craft and generate new sources of income. Ultimately, what I took away from Jim Canary's talk is that it is not enough to preserve one book. Outside of its context, it is just one thing. The book as an object itself is important evidence of a people in a place and time. Yet if you let die the living traditions that created the book in the first place, you can also lose valuable knowledge that can help in its preservation. It is important to view the book as a part of a whole and to help preserve its context. Now that we had a chance to look at the context of a book on a macro level, let's take a closer look on how preserving its original structures can help discover more knowledge now and in the future. In studies of textual culture, researchers in various disciplines such as history, literature, and economics are looking at the format of a document or book as information, not just at its textuality. In 2006, I attended a rare book school class held at the Walters Museum of Art, Baltimore, with Christopher Clarkson, who had been the conservator of the rare manuscripts at the Walters in the late 1970s. Clarkson wrote a much-cited article on minimal intervention, promoting the benefits of minimizing the treatments on certain bindings, so that later scholars and bookbinders can see the objects in their original state and find evidence of past techniques and materials. For our class, he reviewed a selected group of rare bindings and the condition reports that he wrote during his tenure in the museum. He amended some of his descriptions and treatment recommendations. He would then explain to us why he came to different conclusions based on the 2 or 3 decades of experience that he had acquired since he last examined the books. He concluded that he would not have been able to see the evidence and learn more about the original bindings had he performed treatments that obscured or removed the original materials. One example of minimal intervention is the Re-Engineering Broken Book Spines research group based at the MIT libraries under the leadership of conservator Jana D'Ambrosio. This group is working on a minimally invasive technique for repairing volumes with broken spines or detached boards. Unlike the widely used reback technique, which requires the conservator to lift or remove original components to anchor newly added repair materials, the new procedure removes no original materials and interferes minimally with the original structure. This preserves the artifact's original form and avoids applying our culture's repair materials and aesthetic sensibilities to another culture's heritage materials. This group will present its work at the American Institute for Conservation Conference this coming May. But what if conservation, as we know it, is not the answer? Should we conserve or intervene at all? Arguably, museums, by the very interpretive nature of their work, have had to deal more than libraries with issues of handling their ethnographic collections in ways that are sensitive to their communities of origin. Sometimes their dilemmas involve the tension between professional ethics and the needs of the community's cultural life. It is strange in our Western modern sensibilities to believe that sometimes we should let decay happen and allow an artifact to live a natural life. Should we allow collection items to be used in communal rituals even at the risk of damage? Miriam Clavier, in her book Preserving What is Valued, explored these issues of professional ethics and practices of museums and their relationship with the First Nations people in Canada and New Zealand. Shown in the slide is a table where Clavier compares and contrasts that duality that exists in both points of view. Here illustrated is the dilemma that conservators and indigenous community must negotiate. Is heritage something that can be found solely within an object, or does the value reside in the object as it participates in the living traditions of its people? The other side of the coin for this issue is bias for selection. Is the present not also part of history? In May of last year, conservators Sanchita Balachandran gave a very compelling talk at the American Institute for Conservation's annual meeting in Toronto about the bias that the cultural heritage field holds towards more established forms of art at the expense of the expression of current popular movements. The picture she used to illustrate this was the power washing to remove Black Lives Matter's graffiti off Confederate monuments erected on Baltimore City property. She talked about how in the profession, and I quote, "We have been slow to recognize that objects are not merely a sum of the materials they're made from, but rather that their intangible values may in fact be as important, if not more important, than the tangible heritage we've trained to conserve." Sanchita went on to say, "It is precisely because we have the ability and authority to maintain, change, or erase history, stories, memories, and identities through our interventions on objects, sites, and collections that we must re-engage with three key questions. Who are we? Whose objects are we conserving? And why does conservation matter?" Let's take a look at different approaches to preservation. Internationally, we have institutions like UNESCO that have set guidelines for the recognition and protection of World Heritage. Sometimes the work involves designating a site that has passed the criteria of providing significant cultural context, or a particular document or collection is proclaimed as part of our global collective memory. Most interestingly, the hardest thing to protect are not material, but the intangible qualities that make our sense of belonging to a people, a time, and a place. UNESCO defines intangible cultural heritage as traditions or living expressions inherited from our ancestors and passed on to our descendants, such as oral traditions, performing arts, social practices, rituals, festive events, knowledge and practices concerning nature and the universe, or the knowledge and skills to produce traditional crafts. However, recognition from international agencies can backfire. The issue is that while designating a site under the World Heritage Site Program or under the Blue Shield insignia confers legal protections by international law, the very same designation makes that site a target in areas of conflict and vulnerable to attack. Leila Hussein Mustafa is an assistant professor and subject specialist for Middle East and North Africa at the University of Illinois. She has been conducting research around the world on disaster preparedness and man-made disasters. She recently published an article in the fall 2016 issue of RBM, a journal of rare books, manuscripts, and cultural heritage. In the article, she recounts the story of Nancy Dupré, a scholar who had to flee the fighting in Peshawar and relocated to Kabul, Afghanistan, and her efforts to help recover looted rare books. These books were being sold by the pound by black market vendors who were unaware of their value and occasionally used their pages to wrap food.
Learning about what happened in Afghanistan, it is a story of every country that went through war. And what I learned actually in this research and reading books after books after books is, as much as you are looking for the small details, as much as you feel like why we are not until now, after centuries of war, we are not trying to have a plan to preserve culture materials before the war started. We know now, for example, the Middle East has wars. We are not, until now, there is no really disaster management plan to fit this kind of chaos happening in the Middle East. So what I learned is you need to have someone who is willing to take the risk, and the risk is being a fighter, a librarian who can be a fighter, or a book lover who can be a fighter, and move with the books. And this is what Nancy Dobry did. But she doesn't really value what she did in terms of, like, she didn't record the journey of these books, which is I'm very interested in. Of course, I'm interested in the books, but I'm interested in the journey, how it moved, how many people were here, how many books. And when she went there, who told her about the looting market in Bashwar? And when she learned about it and she decided to buy these looted materials, what was in her mind? How she's going to save it and get it back to the country? Because she did two things. She sent some to United States, where it is her home country in North Carolina, and another she kept it in Bashwar and she moved it back to Kabul.
The miracle is that this book survived at all. The trouble is that there is no documentation on how they were moved to safety in the first place. Leila intends to continue her research to discover the mysterious journey of books salvaged from the ravages of war. As a result of Sanchita Balachandran's talk in AIC, renewed efforts within the organization began to take place. The Equity and Inclusion Working Group created a new charge. However, change at the professional organization level can be slow. Per my inquiries, Sanchita wrote back to me that she felt the need for grassroots effort to start organizing more informally. She created an email group called Concerned Conservators. The group is currently about 70 people from different conservation specialties and at all stages of their career. One outcome from the work of the Concerned Conservators group is the AIC statement against the Dakota Access Pipeline that was first released to the press by AIC on December 2, 2016. It states that as the national professional organization dedicated to the preservation of cultural heritage, we deplore the destruction or desecration of any historic or sacred site and are deeply concerned by the current threat posed to such cultural heritage by the DAPL. AIC also released in February 24 of 2017 a statement against the executive order for the travel ban that would restrict the free entry into the United States of conservation professionals based upon their country of citizenship. Are we waiting for the community to come to us so preservation can occur? Preservation outreach has long been a priority for the ALEX ethos, as initiatives like Preservation Week clearly show. Last year, members of the Preservation Outreach Group inaugurated the Preservation in Action Initiative, or PIA for short. Prior to the start of the 2016 ALA meeting in Orlando, ALA members joined local volunteers at the Orange County Regional History Center to rehouse a collection of films. The event resulted in 400 films rehoused. It also provided training for the center's staff and their local volunteers to help them complete the rest of the rehousing over time. The goal was not just to assist a cultural organization, but to do some preservation outreach to non-preservation librarians. This year, the event will occur in Chicago on Friday, June 23rd, and we're happy to say that the registration is full. Participants will take part in a one-day preservation project at Rebuild Foundation's Stony Island Arts Bank. The day will include preservation care and handling training and hands-on rehousing activities. Working with archival collections such as ephemera and photographs, participants will learn about the preservation needs of different types of materials, appropriate storage, and best practices. Last year, instead of being in Orlando, I was in Humboldt Park in Chicago, attending another kind of community preservation. I participated in the Puerto Rican Tiple construction project, where a master luthier trained a group of complete novices on how to build a Puerto Rican tiple string instrument from scratch. No musical or woodworking experience was required. Each participant gets to keep their tiple. The project started 10 years ago when the tiple was considered almost extinct and has produced more than 200 instruments. There is hope to make more instruments to start a community school for children to learn to play the instrument. How does the Tiple project connect with libraries? Preservation is happening everywhere, with or without us. Local grassroots preservation projects are happening all around us and outside our library walls. We should seek them out and learn from them. Let me tell you about how I'm trying to learn more about preservation from the general public. In April of 2013, during Preservation Week, I had the chance to catch an exhibit of Japanese scrolls at the Freer-Sackler Gallery in Washington, D.C. I must have had preservation in my mind because I saw this scroll entitled Women Airing Books and Clothes. It is an illustration of the autumnal practice in Japan called Mushiboshi, or drawing books. Scrolls of paper, books, kimonos, and other textiles are aired on a crisp, cool day to get rid of the insects and the humidity that are trapped during the summertime. This is a practice performed at homes and temples alike that is tied to the recognition of the changing of the seasons. When I moved later that year to the University of Illinois, I was able to start a research project with preservation grad students that looks for ethnographic preservation practices around the world. We named our research project the Mushiboshi Project, since the practice illustrates an activity that has both overt preservation purposes, but that has evolved into a major cultural and religious tradition in Japan. Not much literature in library science or in conservation research looks at preservation and its correlation to cultural or religious practices. We have been collecting anecdotes from stories or articles that we encounter and that strikes us as good Mushiboshi examples for the project. We are also looking at allied disciplines to find alternative sources of knowledge, much of it captured in oral histories, such as the TEK, Traditional Ecological Knowledge Database resource. The poster shown on this slide was my first attempt to find and evaluate Mushiboshi examples in very old institutions. I was looking at institutions with a proven record of stewardship, so I chose places or collections that had a UNESCO World Heritage Site or Memory of the World designation. I then took the ethnographic practices and I tried to identify where they fall under modern conservation activities. For example, there is the case of two very old libraries, one in Portugal and one in Brazil, that have an unusual approach to pest control. At night, they open their windows to allow bats to come in and eat the critters that are harmful to the books. I noted this as a case of integrated pest management. Or if you look at the annals of the Joseon dynasty in Korea, the practice of geomancy that was used to balance the distribution of energy in the kingdom led the royal court to make copies and establish archives in the 4 cardinal points. When recurring Japanese invasions occurred, only the northern archive survived intact. We compare this with the digital preservation practices of LAX. Lots of copies keep stuff safe. The project is growing, but we need your help. Do you know of any ethnographic preservation practice at home, at work, or in your community or abroad? We are reaching out to our peers to expand our list. Please take this short survey and let us know if we can contact you at a later time to learn more about your Mushiboshi example. Once we have gathered more data from our peers in ALA, we're planning to expand our survey to institutions nationwide and around the world. We will also plan to provide service for the public at large. Eventually, we want to create a map of preservation around the world. We also started a blog called an MX8 blog, where we monthly explore a different kind of Mushiboshi example and share the information as our research grows. Our goal is to see if we can identify practices with little or no cost that have been part of the cultural or religious life around the world and how they can be applied and promoted to library, archives, and the general public. In addition to the outreach initiatives we've just described, it is important that preservation and conservation professionals look inward as well. There are several areas within our own organizations over which we have some influence when it comes to expanding equity, diversity, and inclusion. Often, preservation and conservation staff are involved with exhibits. This could be either an exhibit program at their home institution or loans of their materials for exhibit at other institutions. To the extent that preservation staff are involved in the selection of materials for the exhibit, they cannot advocate for inclusion of underrepresented groups and ideas. Usually the curators will have this in mind, but preservation staff can be one more voice in the room that supports their efforts to be inclusive. A statement such as this one on the website of the University of Kansas Libraries Exhibits program is one way to publicly share and state your commitment to diversity. We can also work to make the exhibit space accessible to people with a range of abilities. For example, captions can be reproduced in large print and braille in a separate booklet for the vision impaired, or captions can be translated for specific language communities. Nancy Godoy, archivist at the Chicano and Chicana Research Collection at Arizona State University Libraries, has several bilingual exhibits online, such as the ones pictured above. Videos and audio recordings that are in the exhibit gallery can be included for print-impaired persons. And of course, videos should be captioned for the hard of hearing. I want to take this opportunity to plug a presentation in the upcoming Alex Exchange in May, a session entitled Preserving Connections, Connecting to Communities Through Preservation Programming, that will feature both Preservation Week and Nancy Godoy's outreach work in the community. Miriam Nelson, Preservation Week Coordinator, will share examples of successful programs across the country from institutions who have taken Preservation Week as a jumping-off point to fully engage with their communities and meet their users where they live. Nancy Godoy will share information about Preserving Arizona's Latino Experience, community-based workshops on archiving preservation, and K-12 curriculum project. As preservation and conservation professionals, we can implement outreach activities that engage diverse communities in our field. In addition to mentoring the history major who is thinking about library school, we can advocate, for example, the use of cultural materials in elementary school classrooms. Quinn Ferris, book conservator at the University of Illinois Library, is also looking at how to expand preservation awareness.
Conservation has a very long history of a certain type of educational approach that is conditional to the various institutions that have required conservation and preservation of those materials. But I think what we're seeing now is that we really have to diversify our approach to education, not just for conservators and not just for preservation professionals, but for all people who share in cultural heritage, so arguably anybody. And on the one hand, you can start with a top-down approach, look at different ways to change conservation education so that it's more open and inclusive and accessible to various people who might have interests in ultimately becoming conservators or preservation professionals. But I think also we need to sort of broaden our idea of who might be interested and enfranchised to that kind of education, including elementary school children, including community members, because once you start treating people with the kind of respect that makes them feel like they have ownership of their own heritage, then a natural awareness begins to grow.
Reaching out to young people is key. Local programs that organize summer employment for high school students can be partners as we create a pipeline of diverse persons who see preservation and conservation as a career option. At MIT Libraries, a conservation lab staff member offered a workshop to Girl Scouts who were working on their book Arts Merit Badge. The thought of MIT is to expand this service to all the troops in the city. It will incur a cost to the MIT library in materials and staff time, but imagine how many young people might be inspired to explore jobs in our field. Quinn is currently in the early planning stage to build a curriculum for younger people to raise the awareness of preservation as a career.
So to build a curriculum, the first thing that would need to happen is conservators and curators together within their collections would get together, look at their materials, see what might be most interesting, what might be most age appropriate, and create a bibliography essentially of materials that could then be used to teach children. Once that's been established, then I think it's a really important part to sort of consider different learning levels at various points in education, and trying to work with teachers to figure out what the best parameters are in that education experience that might enable the children to have a really engaged learning experience in the context of a special collection, but also will not necessarily endanger or create problematic access issues around the special collections materials. So one example of where this has really worked would be Yale's Traveling Scriptorium. This was a program that they put together that was a little kit that could go when requested from institution to institution, and it could be co-opted with other local institutions to go and see holdings that might reflect medieval manuscripts and materials that are affiliated with that, but then also figuring out pieces that a child could touch and interact with, scraps of parchment, scraps of leather, things that they could put their hands on that were not collections materials in order to safeguard the collections materials. And once that was taken care of and completed, and teachers had gone through the process a couple times, it became easier to figure out where the sweet spot lies with working with all of these different factors in terms of the students' interests, but also in protecting the actual collection materials.
During 2016, the MIT Libraries Collections Directorate, which is headed by Greg Gill, sponsored a task force to enumerate the ways in which staff members could manifest the values of diversity, inclusion, and social justice in their daily work. Anne-Marie Wheeler convened this task force, and with 7 of her colleagues from around the directorate, including archives, preservation, cataloging, serials, and collection development, they authored a report that was released publicly last January. A link to the report is on the electronic handout, and we hope the report inspires you to try new initiatives in these important areas. Likewise, other professional and funding organizations are also reviewing their practices.
So there are a few steps being taken in the profession in trying to diversify and equalize our workforce. One of the ones that I'm most related to is that the AIC has started an equity and inclusion working group. Within conservation, we do recognize there are a lot of challenges, but we also recognize that we are not a diverse community right now, and that is something that we feel very strongly that we want to change. However, that working group obviously is only starting to set the groundwork, and there are many other avenues of change that we're hoping to pull in and recommend and whatnot, and that we're going to play off of, but that working group alone is not the only effort. Historically, there's been a lot of interest in making changes in this area from some of the funding agencies and foundations. So the NEH and the IMLS both have interest in increasing diversity in library, museum, conservation fields. The Mellon Foundation and the Getty Foundation have both historically funded efforts quite a lot, particularly in Latin America, in diversifying and broadening conservation education beyond just the boundaries of the United States, and making sure that conservation education can extend beyond our walls. The Mellon Foundation actually has a new initiative as well that's looking at diversity and the values of diversity to culture at large. So it's not focusing just on conservation, but really focusing on the value of diversity writ large and what it means to humanity. And we're hoping to really play into that as well.
Another area where we are empowered to make changes is in the area of hiring. Preservation professionals can and should advocate within their organizations to eliminate unpaid positions. We can and should encourage our institutions to commit to equalizing access to our fields, even if it costs them more money to do the right thing. And of course, there are legitimate positions that involve no payment for work. For example, practicums or individual projects that students complete for course credit. These positions have requirements that are agreed upon in advance and are time limited. Archive professionals have been having this conversation as well. For example, the Archives Fellow Program at Barnard College. Shannon O'Neill, the Associate Director of Archives and Special Collections at Barnard, developed a paid Archives Fellow program after dismantling her Archives Unpaid Internship program. Earlier this year, she told Anne-Marie that one of the reasons behind this program was to open an ethical alternative to unpaid internships, which had previously been offered in her department, but another underlying reason was a deep belief between herself and her colleague, Martha Tenney, that it was their place to take the professional privilege they have and leverage it for up-and-coming professionals. The field of conservation has a tradition of apprenticeship. Following the devastating floods in Florence, Italy in 1966, the field became professionalized and internships were formalized as part of a conservator's training. While this allowed employers to have uniform expectations of the knowledge and skills that conservators would gain through internships, these positions were often low-paying or unpaid. Expecting our future conservation and preservation professionals to acquire experience through unpaid internships places a burden on them. This expectation favors those with economic means and family situations that allow them to work for free and frequently to relocate as well. I asked Jennifer Hain-Tupper, Head of Preservation Services at the University of Illinois Library, how this system narrowed professional opportunities.
Unfortunately, it is really unreasonable to look at the model of current conservation education training and to think about how people from underrepresented groups may be able to financially afford to be able to go into this field. The reason behind that is that, of course, as was already discussed, many of the basic tenets of getting the experience to be able to both apply for conservation training and then to be able to get out of a graduate program and establish yourself as a professional conservator are unpaid or underpaid. And many people who are coming in, perhaps as first generation college attendees, have financial obligations back to their family, or at the very least financial obligations to themselves, to be able to show that their investment in an education shows immediate positive influences back on their family and on themselves. And going into a field like conservation really requires someone to be financially successful before they even begin on that path. And that is a hurdle that we simply can't overcome if we want to broaden the diversity of our field. Today, if somebody is interested in going into an educational program to become a book or paper conservator, they really have rather limited options. Of course, there was the University of Texas at Austin program that demised almost a decade ago at this point, and what we're left with is the University of Delaware with the Winchester program, the NYU program, and Buffalo all offering a Mellon-funded initiative to try to educate people largely within the book and paper within archives focus. However, the funding for that program is wrapping up, and Mellon has started a new initiative where they're looking for new proposals to look at a more long-term solution to that education. That's still out for decision with the Mellon Foundation right now. My understanding is there are basically two proposals in. They may fund one, they may fund none, they may fund both, but that the conservation training programs, being Delaware, NYU, and Buffalo, submitted one proposal together to look at building a book and paper cohort, more or less. And then the University of California at Los Angeles, UCLA, has submitted a proposal that would partner conservation training with a library degree, much more similar to the way it was approached at the University of Texas. So we'll see if UCLA enters the arena or not. But right now, I would say Delaware, NYU, and Buffalo are probably going to stay in the picture, but those are incredibly competitive programs. There are people certainly coming through still doing traditional apprenticeships, though that is harder and harder and rarer to do. Other people are coming through the North Bennett Street School and augmenting that often with a library degree. That's many more years of training. And North Bennett is very clear that though they do educate people on conservation, they are not a conservation training program. So it's a very different experience.
To qualify for admittance to a conservation program, one must complete coursework in chemistry, art history, studio arts, and foreign language, as well as have 2 years of pre-program employment in a conservation lab. Unless a person knows about the field of conservation as an undergraduate, can take the required classes, and have a job lined up in a lab immediately after graduation, there will be a delay before the person is even able to qualify to apply to the very competitive conservation programs. For some, it is simply too late, and they don't have the financial flexibility to enroll in more classes and delay graduate school by 2 years while they gain their pre-program experience. Training in library preservation is not quite as exclusive as training in conservation, yet there are only a few library degree programs that have a concentration in preservation. If a person cannot enroll in one of them, they will have a harder time breaking into this area of librarianship. Many preservation librarians work in academic libraries, and many of those institutions require a second master's degree. That is something that students need to know well in advance of their graduate studies so that they can budget for 2 degrees and choose programs that will meet their needs. So the question is, Are there other ways in which a preservation career is obtainable?
So one possible avenue for increasing diversity through a multi-tiered approach to conservation training might be to bring people in at different levels. We've really focused on bringing people in at professional levels, which is certainly something that needs to be addressed because there are a lot of hurdles into bringing people of diverse communities in at a professional level. However, there are lots of different players in the conservation of cultural heritage, and not all are conservators. One possibility and one avenue that we might consider is whether or not people could start as technicians, which are paying jobs, and they would get on the ground training, more or less, while being paid to be able to learn the field of conservation. But that as opposed to looking at those positions necessarily as the workhorses of the conservation field, which is how we often treat technicians right now, is to look at least some technicians, if not all technicians, as future potential conservators, and to look at building their professionalism and their experience to be able to give back to the field and to build the field and hopefully become the future conservators of tomorrow.
The International Preservation Studies Center is one of the few places that currently provides training opportunity to people who are interested in pursuing preservation careers after graduation. Jennifer Hain-Tepper envisions a partnership with the ISPC to create a multi-tier approach to training in conservation and preservation to ensure that those from marginalized groups have equal access to internship and continuing education opportunities.
So one possible way that the University of Illinois is considering bringing in a more diverse workforce into the conservation field is that we are looking at the possibility of a grant. And that grant would be in partnership with the International Preservation Studies Center to bring people in for professional technician training. So getting both a preservation certificate through the IPSC as well as directed conservation technician training by conservators in a lab for a year to hopefully be able to then launch them into the conservation community as well-trained and functional technicians with an interest in learning more about conservation and being part of this field, with the idea being that at worst we would be populating the field with really qualified, wonderful, diverse technicians, but ideally that some of those people will then really get into this profession and want to pursue it further and be able to climb up into more professional positions in the field.
As in the example of a more inclusive exhibition planning program described earlier in the presentation, we all have the opportunity and the obligation to advocate for equity, diversity, and inclusion elsewhere in our organizations. With that in mind, we want to remind everyone of our professional code of ethics and some of their central cores, which state that as we strive for excellence within ourselves, we should support the advancement and professional development of our existing and future workers, as well as preserve and protect the cultural heritage materials that we handle in our daily work. Our presentation talked about deconstructing our Western ideas of preservation and conservation and being open to different approaches to selection and treatment. We looked at the impact of outreach both through culturally inclusive exhibits and collecting, and also through teaching marginalized communities how to preserve their own history. And lastly, we described ways in which we can increase equity, diversity, and inclusion within our institutions. All of the examples we've mentioned are in a publicly accessible Google document. The link to the source list is in this tiny URL listed below. Please post your ideas and questions so that as we share them, we can start a conversation about how we want our profession to evolve and how we choose to tell our stories. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.